In this lesson, we are going to continue to learn about the impact of the Civil War on South Carolina and specifically on the different groups of people making up South Carolina. As we learned in the last lesson, the plantation owners were exempt under the 20 slave law, which kept the wealthy slave owners from being forced to serve. However, many would join the Confederate Army and serve as officers. So the fact that they had great wealth resulted in them being treated differently in the Confederate Army, where they were immediately moved to the rank of officer. Also reviewed were these terms for slavery. One, that the South argued that slavery is a positive good because, unlike northern factory workers, slaves are cared for throughout their lives. And the South also referred to slavery as the peculiar institution. We learned that in both the North and South, the lower classes served in disproportionate numbers to the elite or wealthy, where in the South, the poor farmers were the main group of people making up the Confederate Army ranks, and in the North, it was the poor factory workers. We learned that before the war, the repetitive theme is slave labor and cash crops brought wealth, social and political status to the planters, and the South defended slavery and the Southern way of life. Before the war, the planters would be excluded by the 20, or exempt under the 20 slave law, or volunteer as officers. After the war, slavery ends and these planters lose their fortunes. Here is a Confederate Army officer uniform, which once again some of the plantation owners chose to enlist and immediately became officers, receiving preferential treatment because of their social status. Now, the next part is about the loss of the Southerners after the war and what each lost. We learned that following the war, the plantation owners, they lost many things, but perhaps one of them, or the most valuable thing that caused them to lose their fortunes was the slaves. The fact that they lost their slaves, most of their money was in slaves. And when the slaves were freed, it was like I tried to illustrate here, their fortunes literally walked off the plantation due to the great amount of money they had spent on their slaves. They also, of course, had property damage, and the Confederate money was worthless even before the war ended. Due to inflation, Confederate money was virtually worthless. After the war, it became even more so. Another reason and another loss of the Southern people was the women, like before, had to take on non-traditional roles as being plantation managers and more or less the head of household, because many of the women became widows when they lost their husband in battle, or their husband come back as amputees missing limbs, which once again made the women have to take on these non-traditional roles as the head of the households, the plantation managers, and other jobs that were usually the men's jobs. So the war changed this. And last, we learned that people had to do without in the South during the war because of the food, clothes, and shoe drives that were going on, which the civilians had to give up these things in order to support the war efforts. Here is a picture of that worthless Confederate money, although it's not worthless today, especially if you have a high denomination bill. John C. Calhoun being on this $100 Confederate bill. Once again, the women, the lives changed during the war because, as in the Revolution, they were left behind to run the farms and plantations. Their lives were made difficult due to the shortage of clothes and food, and had to find substitutes or went without. Once again, inflation made Confederate money worthless. As in the Revolution, some women served as nurses or raised money for the war, and many were forced to flee their homes as the Union Army advanced. Many were left widowed and were forced to be the sole providers of the family. The new part of this lesson concerns mainly African Americans and children, as well as the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation. So, the Union Army is what ultimately freed African Americans in the South. Another way was they ran away to join the Union Army. We had the Emancipation Proclamation, but as we learned in the last lesson, many Southerners never listened to it, so it's not considered as a means by which the slaves were freed. So many slaves ran away to join the Union Army, but many were still waiting on the plantation and hoped that the Union would free them. Before we get back to the African Americans in the war, first we're going to talk about the lives of children during the war, which differed very much from the lives of children today. So, pretty much, the children during the war, they did many roles. They helped around the house. Some, in the Confederate Army especially, would have roles in the Army as drummer boys and flag carriers called standard bearers. So here's a fictional scenario of the plantation, and we're going to pretend that we have a little boy named William to use this. We're going to put his hat on sideways. And here's his mother going, "Come back here, William. You must help me around the plantation." Now this is true. Many children did have to help around the plantation. And she would say, "Because your father is away fighting," of course this is a plantation, so he would have been an officer if he chose to serve, because he was one of the more wealthy. William, probably like 5 years old, "But I want to play." So mother scolds him. "Well, at least you don't have to serve in the war," probably because you're more wealthy, "as a drummer boy or a standard bearer like the poor people's children." Standard bearer being the flag carrier, which we'll see here in a moment. And let's show what the drummer boy, so some of the poor children were probably excited to have their drum, but many died in this war. And I have this fictional scenario, "Woohoo, a drum! I lead the army." It's true, the drums did lead the army. Or this gentleman with a flag, a standard. As we know, we've learned about the importance of the flags and what they meant. And some of these children, astonishingly, they were only 10 years old, and they were out there in the heat of the battle, and many were caught in the crossfire and died, sadly. I don't think anybody would deliberately target the children, but many perished because they were right in the middle of the fighting and perished. So the lives of children changed very much during the war, where they would either be having to work on the plantation or maybe around the farm if they didn't have to, but still some of the children took a direct part in the war as a standard bearer or a drummer boy. Here are a few actual pictures of children in the Civil War. You can see this child. I can't really, I see a pouch here. I'm not sure about his job. Here's an African American boy, because some of the Southerners took their slaves with them to the war. So both slave and free children assisted around the farm or the plantation, and some boys as young as 10 enlisted in the army. Here's a better picture of a young boy whose job it would be to play the drum, a drummer boy. And of course, here's a teenager. He looks like being a standard bearer, which is those that carried the flag and kind of gave direction to the armies in some ways. Here's further enhancements of the lesson. Some served as drummer boys or standard bearers. Many were caught in the crossfire and passed away. The lives of children would change after the war, because many after the war were left with without fathers, or had fathers who were unable to work due to injuries. The last part of this lesson has to do with the Emancipation Proclamation. And the effect of the Emancipation Proclamation, which we've already touched upon. Well, by now, we hopefully know that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Abraham Lincoln, and it would be the first time the government mentioned freeing slaves. However, as we learn, the Southerners never listened to it. And actually, the intricacies of the Emancipation Proclamation is that it was kind of a political move, as we'll learn, that Abraham Lincoln issued to get African Americans to join the Army. Although, as I've also mentioned, research into Lincoln indicates that he absolutely hated slavery. Well, Abraham Lincoln, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation is a declaration that all slaves in areas that had not yet been captured by the Union Army are free. Now, this was partially because Lincoln wanted African Americans to join the Union Army, and thousands did, including the one that led the charge on Fort Wagner, which would be what? Yes, the 54th Massachusetts Unit. Many of those African Americans volunteered once Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, pretty much the Southerners said, I'm not listening to this Union president. Y'all slaves work. You're not going anywhere. The slaves said, but The Emancipation Proclamation said we're free. Said, I'm not listening to that Union president. And that was the general attitude towards the Emancipation Proclamation in the South. No one listened to it. Instead, the slaves had to be freed by the Union Army. One of the ways they could be freed, one, by the Union Army, two, they might run away. But the Emancipation Proclamation really did nothing to free them. Lincoln's like, listen to this, South. Do it. Said, oh, you won't, huh? Well, that's all right, because when we conquer you, the Army will set the slaves free anyway. So, to further exaggerate that fact, African Americans, as we learned, wanted freedom. Many ran away to nearby Union armies. Others stayed on the plantation waiting for the Union Army. The Emancipation Proclamation is Lincoln frees all the slaves in areas that had not been captured by the Union Army. The problem, these are Confederate states and it is ignored, and most slaves stay on the plantations. The Emancipation Proclamation does not free slaves, the military does. This was a political move to get the slaves and free African Americans to join the Union, and they do immediately. Here's once again some of the pictures of the Emancipation Proclamation. This here, they might say, what does this represent? Well, if it's African Americans thanking Lincoln, it's for the Emancipation Proclamation. The first time our government said they were going to end slavery at all. Now, African American service in the war, of course, was made possible by the Emancipation Proclamation. Many African Americans did want to sign up if this is the war to end slavery in the Confederacy. Freed and runaway slaves fought for the Union. Sometimes the runaways just joined up and said, we want to join. And the Union, of course, would let them. Well, the Emancipation Proclamation caused an outpouring of volunteers to the Union Army. Now, slaves also would be brought into battle for the Confederacy. Some owners took their slaves with them to the war, especially if they were an officer and they're used to be having pretty much a personal slave that was like a butler. And then other slaves were, what's it called when the government will take over civilian stuff. Starts with a C. Yes, commandeered. Other slaves were commandeered to build defenses. They also built prisons, such as one of the most famous prisons where Union soldiers were taken and pretty much, I think, half taken there died, was called Andersonville. They built this notorious Confederate prison in the South. So, just an example here of what commandeered slaves built. So, continuing with the lesson on African Americans in the war, much of what I said is on this slide. Now this I have not covered yet. This is in the Union, and this would be indicative of what the 54th Massachusetts would experience. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans that volunteered were put into units, and the 54th was the first of that. And they didn't experience the same respect that the white units did. Those that served were discriminated against. As was already mentioned, the 54th and others served under the leadership of white officers. What has not been mentioned is that African American units were paid less than their white comrades. This cannot happen today because this would be known as discrimination, to pay one group less based on race. A business doing this would be fired, would experience all kinds of lawsuits and have to pay the difference back. Some African Americans were put into service in the Confederate armies, whereby the masters took their slaves with them to the battlefield or to build defenses. Once again, this is the most famous of the Union African American units, the 54th Massachusetts. There's their colonel, leader, Robert Gould Shaw. There are some of the men in the 54th, which numbered in excess of 600. Well, this completes our lesson on service in the Civil War and the different roles that different members of society would play. In the next lesson, we will learn about the beginning to rebuild the South, but it was actually more restructuring the Southern society to operate without slaves. And that period in history is known as the Reconstruction era. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.